Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to give you an actual characterization for the prerequisites for the development of these emerging democracies and how they developed and liberalized. Note, the countries that we're talking about start as politically unstable, with weak economies, with constant and consistent conflict and coups, with no stable democracy or government. These are often post-colonial countries, such as in Africa or Southeast Asia. How do you get then from those to strong democracies with political freedoms, with diverse economies? OG tells you that the pathway forward is to get the politics right, make the politics really competitive, make it really democratic, and then everything else will follow. We tell you that that is not the case and has never happened, and we will explain to you that the alternative mechanism is to have consistent and stable political regime and have economic development. How does economic development, therefore, give us the end state of democratic freedom that we agree we should all aspire to? First, it creates a middle class with the time and energy for political participation, to actually go out and vote, to go out and educate themselves, to create other political parties. They think that there are tons of these really powerful opposition parties that are going to be happening. What are there? What political contestation can there be if the dominant political party is dominant? There isn't any meaningful one at all. Secondly, interaction with foreign companies and with foreign individuals, such as with FDI, where companies come in and bring best practices and have incentive to liberalize and further democratize the courts to improve their stability, and just through openness of freedom of press and interaction in the international economy, learning about political freedoms and becoming less reliant on state propaganda for their freedoms. We tell you, therefore, this is the dominant model of political liberalization that has happened, that is via economic liberalization and economic progress. This is what has happened time and time again in India, in Singapore, in countries in Africa, and in countries such as Bangladesh. What do you need, therefore, for economic stability? You need consistent political stability. It doesn't matter if it's a good government. It's fine if it's a corrupt government, but it needs to be consistent and stable. Why? Because you're not going to start a business if there's an unstable political regime, if you don't know if the taxes are going to go up dramatically the next day, if you don't know if there's going to be a warlord who's going to take over your territory or destroy the roads. You know that FDI is certainly not going to come in, because Goldman Sachs investors are going to not look favorably on you in earnings calls if you're doing these very risky plays in countries in Africa. And smart people aren't going to move to your country. And if they do grow up in your country, they're going to leave your country if they think that there's an unstable political regime. This is more important than the quality of the regime. And this is a really important distinction, because corruption consistently applied is corruption, but it's not risky. That is, in Russia today, I know exactly how much of a bribe I need to pay in order to participate in particular economic activities, or to get out of a ticket. There's a secondary political market in bribes and in corruption that is consistent and is knowable from before. But if that's changing on a day-to-day basis, that destroys that kind of consistency. So how does their model destroy that kind of stability? Let's give them their best case scenario, which is that their model works perfectly. There's two problems here. First, there's an inconsistent rule of law. If you're constantly changing dominant parties, this means that they're comparatively less competent and less developed. And so that means that they change drastically. What does this mean? Political contestation in developed countries happens in the context of an established rule of law and an established bureaucracy. And these nascent democracies, laws are much less fixed, they're much more fluid. So with every change in dominant political party, laws change much more drastically. That is, the delta is much greater. And so therefore, when you change political parties constantly, you can get drastically different rule of law and application of law. Secondly, there's a lack of competency here. That is, there's no entrenched bureaucracy. So when a new party comes into power, they sweep out all the other bureaucrats because they're incredibly suspicious of them and campaigned on the fact that these people are corrupt, et cetera, which means they just don't have an administrative state and need to rebuild it from the ground up, which means you can't actually have any kind of economic growth. Compare that to the OG's benefits. They say, well, there's going to be more competition among parties because there's going to be economists. This characterization of these minority parties as good and acting in good faith is silly. They're going to compete in the same way that the dominant political party is going to compete. They're going to steal votes in the exact same way because they believe that that's the only way to win, and they're probably right. They're going to use race baiting and those kinds of tensions to compete, not on who has the best taxation policy. That barely even happens in the developed world, guys. Come on. Secondly, they're like, there's going to be more coalition building. A, there could be irreconcilable differences among these parties, such as ethnic minorities. B, this is really unstable. Like if in Israel, what's happening right now, which is that there is no majority government for a year, they're kind of getting along fine because they have a bureaucratic state. If you have election after election where there are unstable coalitions and constantly changing political landscape, you don't have an administrative state. Your state actually crumbles. I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, so when most of these developing countries' economies are dominated by state-owned enterprises created by members within your own party, what incentive is there for them to be accountable, no longer have a monopoly, and for other businesses to move in?
I don't understand why there's any incentive for them to be accountable in the government case either. If you're breaking up the dominant SOEs, the party that comes into power has every incentive to get in bed with those SOEs because they know that that's the locus of their power. That was just the analysis that is provided by OG. We're not telling you that there's an immediate solution. What we're telling you, as you slowly economically liberalize and you get more competition, you're going to dismantle the SOEs in the same way that SOEs have been dismantled historically in countries like India and post-Soviet states as economic liberalization happened, and that leads to political liberalization, and then you can dismantle the grip that these companies have. But this was the best case scenario, note. What's a worst case scenario? Well, the court is destroyed because since the court is the one that is implementing, that means that the court these decisions are relatively subjective. That means court packing is going to happen even more than in the status quo. This destroys the rule of law. Now, they may say, well, it's marginal because in the status quo, obviously there are incentives for this. But note that in the status quo, there are counter incentives, that is from corporations to have a consistently enforced rule of law, and particularly from foreign corporations who want this kind of consistency. And their side of the house, the incentive is so overwhelming for the state to court pack and to destroy any sense of legal legitimacy that prevents the kind of legal stability and property rights framework that is essential for corporate capitalistic development. But that's not even the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that there is going to be structural political and military conflict where the incumbent party becomes wary of any kind of upstarts and becomes wary of the court because they know that if they lose power, they're very corrupt, they're likely to be tried, and they're likely to be executed for their crimes, as many past incumbent political parties have been when they lose power. Their supporters also want to prop up their own cushy economic situations, which they know won't necessarily exist, which means things like disbanding the court holistically, which means that having military dictatorship and coups happen in a recurring cycle destroy these countries' economies like those in the sub-Saharan region and in the Sudan and Africa. This, like the easy example here is, think about South Africa, which is a post-colonialist state. If you break up the majority power and a minority white coalition comes into power, this would be unacceptable to the vast majority of Black citizens who fought against that kind of repression. This is the kind of cyclical violence that is going to happen on side government. We're incredibly, incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you. And now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello, we're good. Can you guys all hear me?
Yep.
All right. I'm terrible at paying attention to chat, so I'll just try to invite a POI during my speech. You're free to try to ask anyways. All right. 3 points of discussion in this speech. First, on their principled matter of choice. Secondly, a discussion of the mechanistic issues that have cropped up after their case has been clarified. And then finally, some discussion of actual solvency, right? Imagining what their country looks like in the best and worst case scenarios in the future. So first on this discussion of choice, right? Because they seem to rest a lot of their hats on this principled idea that the people within these democracies ought to have the choice. But I think they don't actually really consider the choice that they have, right? Either it is the case that these parties are wildly popular and accountable and continue to get reelected, as is the case in states like Singapore, in which case you're literally removing choice from these people who legitimately want the same party to remain in power, or there are massive issues with electoral fairness, such that these elections that exist are not fair and are not just, right? If this is the case, and this seems to be what they're suggesting, then Gov's case does nothing to actually deal with these issues, right? They're merely dealing with the symptom of these corrupt issues, being that the same power party who is in power can continually get themselves reelected. They're not dealing with the cause, right? All that they're doing is merely replacing one despot with another without resolving any of the actual problems. Whereas we gave you actual solvency, right? We told you that you get better economic development on our side of the house, even if it's the same corrupt power remaining in power. And with this economic development comes political development in the long run and democratization, right? But they say there are issues sometimes with things like cult of personality, right? This leader won us the war, and so we're going to keep electing him. But again, I think we solve for this when we say that eventually, even if this leader continually remains in power, the economic development that this invites leads to eventual political realization, right? We would point to the example of Taiwan, for example, right? Where Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang was able to win elections off the basis of his cult of personality. This is a party that has not been doing very, very poorly recently as a result of the country actually developing a strong system of democracy that has followed their robust development of economics, right? Finally, they talk about this issue of accumulation of assets. So two responses here, right? One, like the accumulation of assets by the dominant political party is something that tends to be very deeply unpopular among the people within that democracy, right? If they see that the dominant political party is just seeking rents and stealing all of their wealth, then we think that they're likely to be ousted, right? If it's the case that the state is so corrupt that they're able to remain in power, then we suggest that in the long run, even though their interests are to accumulate wealth, this in turn then also leads to economic development, right? Because they want to be able to collect more in taxes and earn more wealth. And as we told you, with economic development comes political development, but not the other way around. Next, let's talk about the issue of their model, right? So I think fundamentally there are some issues, even if we take their case at the best case scenario, right? The problem is that their know it when I see it standard of relying on experts just does not work, right? There is no good proxy for what dominance is, and this is something that you have to decide ex ante, right? And so it cannot take into account extant issues, for example, crises, right? Something right now where a protracted global pandemic is going on, I think we would generally prefer a lot of stability and leadership instead of having the courts deciding, well, now one party is too strong, we're going to oust everyone else, right? There are also often endemic issues with the opposition as well, right? For example, a state in which the major opposition gets completely eviscerated due to corruption convictions and takes years to rebuild. We think that their model cannot account for any of these things because there needs to be objective metrics that are established ex ante that can't be fudged or cheated, right? If they're just saying we're going to have know it when I see it type of things for when a party is too dominant, well then there are, like, I think very obvious, self-evidently obvious reasons why that's terrible, right? Then the party that is in power can just continue to litigate these issues and not get ousted, which seems to be the opposite of what they want. I also think you get much, much worse in terms of corrupting political incentives, both for dominant parties and for opposition parties, right? For the dominant party, as Pasha explained, and was never even contested, there is massive incentive to destabilize and corrupt the judiciary system, right? Whereas conversely, without this policy, there is a strong incentive to maintain an impartial judiciary because of this idea of reciprocity and the idea that having an unbiased judiciary is good for business, right? But obviously, because the courts are the mechanism on their side of the house, there's a massive incentive to corrupt the courts, but also the military, right? Because the military is likely going to be the need of the mechanism to actually result in this political shift, right? If the dominant party knows that, then there's likely to be much more political capture of the military, which we also think is particularly bad because it is in these states when the dominant party and the military are in bed with each other that leads to more likely instances of oppression of the people. If closing has a point, I'll take it. If not, from opening.
Yeah, so when Igbo people in Nigeria feel as if the dominant party no longer represents them, that sparks things like the Biafran Civil War. So under your side, how are civil conflicts effective in benefiting for economic development?
So I think they need to be comparative, right? On their side of the house, every time you get this massive political upheaval, you also get civil war, right? On our side of the house, if there is one particularly dominant power, then they're able to rein in a lot of these domestic conflicts, right? Even if it is politically oppressive, we tell you political liberalization comes afterwards, but what comes first needs to be this economic development, which they never get on their side of the house, right? On their side, they just keep having these political turmoil every 10 years or so, and 50 years from now, Nigeria is just as poor today and just as conflicted. The second issue I want to talk about, though, is the corruption of opposition parties, right? Number one, we just think there's massive political incentive to sabotage, give these frivolous challenges, but also to often not give good faith opposition, right? If the existing dominant power is close to being considered dominant, then your interests become to allow them to accumulate more political power, right? We think these corrupting incentives to not actually offer proper opposition and to actually collaborate with the party in power is very problematic. Finally, let's consider the weighing, right? We tell you we're team in this debate that gave you an actual pathway for how countries develop, modernize, and liberalize, right? Side government has not offered a single example of when this type of political turmoil that they imagine of just shaking things up when things aren't going well actually worked. We gave you the pathway of countries like Taiwan, of countries like Japan and South Korea and Singapore that started as nascent democracies and were controlled by one political party for decades. But through this control, they were able to exercise that power in order to develop their economies, which Pasha explained uniquely doesn't happen when you have the instability and uncertainty of political upheaval. And once the middle classes in these countries developed, once they were able to become wealthy, that's when these countries actually became democracies on their side of the house, right? And the best case scenario that they have, and this is being exceptionally charitable, there is still this uncertainty. There is still this chance of political upheaval. That means they get no FDI, no investment, and no economic development. 50 years from now, they're just as poor. But in the worst case scenario, every time this upheaval does occur, you actually get things like civil conflicts, which we think is also bad. So we clearly dominate their case, both in the best case and the worst case scenario, because 50 years from now, our countries are wealthy and democratic, where theirs are just as poor and undemocratic. Exceptionally proud to oppose.
Thank you. Now calling on the member of government.
The largest threat to economic and holistic stability that exists is ethnic violence. My political science nerd brain is incredibly excited for our extension about how ethnic capture by a single political party is the single gravest threat to people's livelihoods and to stability. I'm going to start out by beating the OOKs and then get into our extension about how we uniquely prevent ethnic violence under our side of the house. Rebuttal. The first claim that I want to refute is the argument that court packing is like really bad and it's going to happen. A few things. Firstly, if court packing happened, it just mitigates the entire rant, right? Because what you just get is like larger parties. So I think that they need to engage with how this actually operates, but a few reasons why it won't happen. Firstly, these are emerging democracies rather than dictatorships. What this means that within constitutions, there's often a basic level of judicial independence that is granted, meaning that there's often like buffering against just like one party blatantly trying to court pack. Secondly, there's likely to be a large degree of political scrutiny over how these processes operate. This is because this is an issue that like voters care a lot about, so there will be domestic political backlash if you're seen as abusing the process, but it's also fairly easy to just get like targeted international monitoring of instances of this happening, where like the UN just comes in and they make sure that you're not abusing how this court process ultimately works. Finally, individual political parties have a self-interested incentive not to engage in court packing. This is because that there's always a risk that in the future they might lose forms of political power and then suffer when an opposition party decides to court pack as well. So there is a self-interested incentive to sustain a basic level of judicial norms. In terms of them like trying to take over the military, unclear about a threshold because there is an incentive to politically cut the military anyways. The next claim that we get is that what if like white people in South Africa now come to power? Black people in South Africa are still the majority. They're just going to vote for a black party. But the difference is it's now a minority black party will probably be more accountable than the ANC is under the status quo. I think the best OO material that we get is that it's really important to have a government that is like stable, and you get less stability when you get a continual fluctuation of legislation. A few responses. Response one, just because you are one party, it does not mean that the West will like you. In order for the West to like trade with you, you have to be A, strategically important, but B, they often just care about like really weird things and like very robust democratic norms to like a ridiculously large extent, meaning that the IMF would just like arbitrarily preclude certain states. Secondly, unclear that you're actually going to get like the random change of laws that they try and talk about. Firstly, if you're the opposition party and you come to power, and like a mega drastic change of business legislation is going to sabotage your own state economically, why the hell would you do that, right? Because you also care about long-term economic growth for your own legitimacy overall. But secondly, also just don't think that like business regulations are like politically flashy issues to the point where parties are just going to like randomly overturn those. Our extension about ethnic violence, note that I will explicitly weigh our impact against OO as well at the end of my speech. Our extension is that we're going to reduce the probability of ethnic violence. Under the status quo, dominant political parties tend to amalgamate around a single ethnic group. This is because of firstly what OG says, we've often like won a particular war, but secondly, ethnicity is the easiest political cleavage that exists because you get an automatic support base who will probably vote for you based on feelings of brotherhood that ultimately exists. Crucially, Crucially, when you have one ethnic party that forms, unless there's a revolution, which we say is like a plausible thing, I want to just quickly offer a few better mechanisms in opening government about how you're going to like perpetually become dominant over time and there aren't sufficient checks and balances. Firstly, as Chris mentions in a POI, you have control over SOEs, which makes you wealthier. And know that the first party that controls the SOEs has the economic advantage because they just staff those SOEs with like people who are trustworthy to them. And they just get an immediate capital inflow, which makes them richer. And the richer that you are, the easier it is to sustain your patronage networks and to develop political favors, but also to engage in like advertising during the election process. Secondly, as the first party, you have like the first control over state-run media corporations, meaning that you can also staff these with loyalists, but more importantly, the first impression that people within your state have about your party is going to be good. Thirdly, there's a lack of checks and balances within your government when it comes to managing elections. If you're literally the only party in a position of power, things like gerrymandering and like blatant rigging are a lot easier when you don't have other party within your coalition to be able to check against you. What you then end up getting is ethnic capture, like the UMNO in Malaysia or the Rajapaksa clan in Sri Lanka. You have like large quantities of political power. How then does an ethnically dominant party create a recipe for political violence? Three mechanisms here. Firstly, one ethnic group ends up getting an asymmetric access to economic resources. This is because a party in a position of power has a feeling of brotherhood and loyalty to their own ethnic group, but also because they rely on that group rather than any other for a basis of like political support. So what you get is disproportionate investment in like Nigeria into Christian over Muslim communities, for example, or in Malaysia, affirmative action policies that disproportionately benefit one ethnic group. This is bad because you create systematic poverty against one ethnic group or a greater feeling of economic exclusion. The poorer that you are, the greater the probability that you will engage in violence because you feel angry, but also you have less to lose from violence when your economic conditions to start off with are substantially worse. Secondly, these parties rise to power in the first place on the basis of ethnic nationalism. Like, this is because, once again, you just care a lot about like your own ethnic group, but you also just like have a maximal incentive to perpetuate this rhetoric with absolutely no backlash whatsoever, right? Because like riling up your base is just good for your approval ratings, your support network, stuff like that overall. So you get an active demonization of other ethnic groups that then normalizes violence. Thirdly, though, you get just like a feeling of political exclusion. No one in my government looks like me. No one in my government is from my ethnic group. The government does not care about me. The government is biased against me. This is the precise rhetoric that creates feelings of radicalization. Why, even if the comparative is imperfect, is it better? A few reasons. Firstly, you now get multiple parties belonging to the same ethnic group, right? Because like ethnic groups are often majorities. When you break them up, you get a smaller number of political parties. When you no longer have a comparative advantage on the basis of ethnicity, because there are multiple Black parties or multiple like Muslim parties, you now need to try and advantage yourself based on other things, right? So you have to compete on like economic policies to a larger extent, and you just diminish the incentive for ethnically inflammatory rhetoric. Secondly, you need the cooperation of other ethnic groups within government to be able to pass policy. Within government, there's likely to be things like competitive horse trading of favors that exist, where in order to pass a bill, you need the support of an ethnic clan that might be oppositional to you in order for your own voters not to get mad because you are seen as ultimately hijacking that political coalition. So you have an incentive not to demonize too much, to have a basic level of efficacy in government overall. Thirdly, you get a more even distribution of ethnic patronage networks, where at the very least, you increase the probability of having like a different party in government from a different ethnic group when you just have more parties operating overall. So especially in like PR systems, it's easy to just get one party. What then are the impacts of this argument? Firstly, even if no violence, it's bad to subject people to political exclusion. Secondly, you get large-scale civil wars when groups feel like you're not represented in government, like the Biafra Civil War, like the Tamil Tigers overall. People die and they starve. Thirdly, this is a perfect recipe for separatist regions as well, like the English region of Cameroon that has incentive to secede because their state is not representing them. Crucially, the government often then just like cracks down on these ethnic groups, which creates a perpetual spiral of violence. Why is this the most important? Firstly, violence deters any economic growth. If you get a new government via revolution, there's not stability. Foreign businesses won't come in if workers might be killed. You literally destroy infrastructure. You cannot build businesses. Secondly, this outframes opening government because violence is the gravest threat to my choice. All other choices stem from my right to be alive. A feeling of principled representation is less important than my ability to feed myself, to feed my family, not to go to bed every night scared, could not be prouder to stand in closing government.
Thank you. Now calling on the member of government.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Awesome. 3, 2.
Actually, could you speak a little louder?
Oh, yeah.
With the mic tick. Thank you.
Am I clear now?
Yes.
Awesome. 3, 2, 1, go. 2 points of extension from closing opposition, both of them taking directly the metric proposed to us by both governments, and that is where do we have a more democratic procedure or a more free choice for the people. So the first one will be on why just inherently we take away people's choice by this mechanism, and secondly will be about the distrust in the democratic procedure that this mechanism is going to create, leading to long run more likelihood of falling back to authoritarianism. Before that, 6 points of extenders rebuttal to the entirety of government. First, just to take the easiest part of the table, but one that was important for some reason for both governments and especially OG. Most countries in the world are not the US. I have a lot of shit to say about your country, we'll put it aside for a sec, but specifically the mechanism of having corporations funding political parties and campaigns is illegal in most countries, and we are happy to support it being illegal. We think it is likely to be the case in any way. But even if for some reason we think that most emerging democracies are somehow like the US and have this sort of corporates funding political process, we think that you have opposing interests in the free market. The reason why in the US you see the GOP funded by NRA and the Democratic Party funded by Planned Parenthood is because you have different organizations with money, with different incentives. So we think that there is sufficient competition here. But again, we just don't think it's in the debate because it is illegal in most countries. Secondly, and this was something that was brought along throughout government, the idea that people are somehow blinded by either from OG name recognition or from CG, they have the same color as me. We are really unclear why. It seems like government bench kind of assumes that people are stupid and can't make an informed choice. Note the fact that so many people don't vote on someone just based on their color or their name, but actually listen to what they have to offer, because people do care about things as important as, you know, what has significant stakes on their livelihood, such as political elections. No analysis comes as to why people are so stupid, a bit too late if it comes from WEEP. But specifically to CG on that, by the way, I would also flag that as much as we white people like to think of people who are black as an ethnicity, please note that most countries who are emerging democracies have a very fractured ethnicity with like more than a dozen different ethnicities, meaning that it is completely unlikely to have a vast majority of one ethnicity. Yes, most South Africans are black, but most South Africans are not from the same ethnic group, right? Meaning that it is hard for a political party to just say, we are from the majority, because there is no majority. Everyone has like 10% or so of the population. Thirdly, checks and balances. No explanation as to why government's mechanism is the only way to solve it. Insofar as CG goes so much through the effort of analyzing why these courts are likely to be good and not corrupt, etc., most likely they can also be maintaining the balances of democracy and say this party is becoming too nationalist, and specifically for these grounds it needs to be disqualified, not on the grounds that just it's being popular, which means it is, you know, doing what people want it to be. Fourthly, just notice the fact most political systems are parliamentary, meaning that you have some sort of balance. You need to also please other parties to form a coalition, even if you are a dominant party in yourself. Fifthly, primaries. It is likely that many of these parties have primaries within them, meaning that it is easy for you to somewhat advance your own political opinions within the party itself, even if it is extremely dominant. Lastly, presidents. Most of these political parties don't want to risk taking too much power, because they know that if they're going to be elected out of office tomorrow, this will be power used against them as well. It is like a double-edged sword that they don't want to give the precedence to. Happy to stand on opposition. Let's move to our point, starting with choice. Why do we think we take away people's choice quite inherently? So the obvious part of this debate is we take away the party that they wanted to vote for. Now, obviously, they still have their opinions and they can still vote upon them. However, 3 things that we think are unique to the existing parties that we cannot just replace by the fact that people are still voting based on their opinion. Firstly, trust. Part of my reason to choose someone and part of my free choice is not only what technically they say they will do, but me knowing that they will keep to their promises. Trust is something that I developed for a party that I know and not for a party that is new, even if they have the same platform. Secondly, ability to execute. Even if a party is very loyal to me and has the very same agenda as myself, if they are not willing to compromise, if they don't know how to act in the parliament, which is also, by the way, very likely in a less experienced party, then I don't know as much as I want to vote for them. But thirdly, insofar as OG concedes in the POI that we give them a clarification that probably the complex of the people involved in these parties are going to change, it means that also the ideology is likely to change somewhat. So yes, they're technically going to still be left or right or some vague term such as that, but their intensity of preferences, what they prioritize, their specific ideology regarding what sort of brand of left they are doing, etc., is going to change. All of these 3 mechanisms explain why it is likely that the new parties are going to be different, and different is bad because the parties that we took down were popular, meaning that most people wanted them in office, most people thought that they represent them. We take away people's choice to have who actually represents them. But secondly, in terms of information, we also want people to have an informed choice, like OG themselves conceded. We think that people have a less informed choice in a new party, that A, we have less a history of criticizing in the media, and B, you know less what they actually did because you don't have the history of knowing how they follow up to their promises, which is crucial because note, most of these emerging democracies don't have a very large history of democracy, don't have a very developed free press and media, meaning that they don't have a lot of sources of information about the political parties that they vote for, aside from the past, from the history, from knowing what they did before. If we take this away from them, we also lead to a less informed choice. Therefore, we take away their choice and we take away their ability to be informed on their choice. Therefore, we take away democracy. Before I move on, opening government.
Your first 5 layers of mitigations only increases better or else it has as competition increases. Last layer was that party is scared of consolidating power because if they get voted out of office. But the problem is that this is a dominant political party.
Often there is 2 dominant political parties. That means that they can go out of office still. Like in the US, you have 2 dominant political parties. But secondly, I realized that what I did in the beginning of my speech is mitigations. It's just that mitigations also win debates because it means that you have almost no delta. Let's go to distrust. Look, we think that in general, we're going to make people trust less the democratic procedure and the courts. 3 reasons for this. Firstly, just the courts themselves are going to be perceived as though they are infringing on democracy. Please note, we don't even need to prove that the courts indeed are corrupt. Even if CG is completely correct in their analysis and the courts are never going to be corrupt, it is very easy and in the incentives of politicians to politicize the narrative and say they are taking us down because of political incentives and corruption. It means the public is going to get a lot of explanation from their political nominees on why the courts are not to be trusted. Secondly, the politicians themselves are going to now change their skin so much more often, right? Because when some politicians are going to now move between parties because the parties have been taken down and replaced, it means that some of them are going to need to change their loyalties and they're going to need to change their ideologies and look as though they're not consistent. Thirdly, the fact that there's going to be much more dependency on kingmakers because when you don't have an established party and you have a much more fractured system, you need to cater much more to pressure groups and smaller parties that are kingmakers now, meaning that all in all, people are going to get a perception of corruption. They're going to see that you are not following through to your word, that you're changing your skin, that the courts infringe on their democracy, and that you're doing differently than what the majority of the people wanted you just because you're catering to a minority of parties. This leads to people trusting the system less, which is crucial because these countries often have a tendency to fall back to authoritarianism like we've seen in Brazil, and it is crucial to make people see that they can trust democratic procedure. Beg you to oppose.
Thank you. And now call upon the Gov Whip.
I want to talk about 3 things. First, I'm going to talk about closing opposition. Secondly, I'm going to talk about violence and why it is the most important impact and mechanisms in this debate. And finally, I'm going to weigh in a little bit on opening half and talk about why Naomi uniquely fills the hole that happens in OG's case. Starting off with closing opposition. I think that the critical mistake that a lot of opposition bench has made so far is that so much of their arguments are hung off on this notion that these parties are inherently stable, and because of that, that means that these people had to have made a free choice about it. 3 problems with this. Number 1, when it is that the ANC is literally built off of the national culture of what South Africa looks like right now, when they are oftentimes revolved around one strongman that is never accountable, no matter how many shitty policies they create. For example, Modi with the canceling of cash very suddenly. And when these ideologies don't change oftentimes for decades, because many of these political parties run on this narrative of the only reason why we are even independent in the very first place is because of the fact that you took your trust on us. It is not an ideology that people opt into. It is an ideology that is coerced into them from the very, very start. Secondly, though, this ignores all of the analysis about why, even if it is a free choice, there is no free manifestation of this choice, because oftentimes people do undemocratic things. For example, gerrymandering, as Naomi mentions, but also because of the fact that these ideologies can't change within these parties. For example, things such as party whips are incredibly powerful, and when the leadership within the party determines which electoral districts you are going to actually be in and how much campaign funding you're actually going to get, there's never an incentive for you as an individual politician to ever directly attack and make sure that the leadership is accountable. Finally, though, even if you have trust inside of this party, it is imperfect trust because it is based on imperfect information. When it is that these parties control the media narratives and, more importantly, have no incentive to keep people within the party into account, that means atrocities and undemocratic practices don't necessarily come to light. light. So you can never hear a scandal about a politician within that individual party because there's nobody else within the dominant party that wants to release that scandal in the very first place. So even if it is a choice that people made because they trust this party, it is based off of imperfect information so that it's imperfect trust. The next thing that they say is that, oh, but these new parties might know less and might have to be susceptible to many pressure groups. Guys, pressure groups is exactly the analysis that we told you about, which is that these pressure groups are oftentimes other ethnicities and other coalitions that you are now incentivized to build. The benefit of that is all the analysis about violence. Secondly, this is an argument against any new party whatsoever, because if this is the argument against any new party coming up, because you will always have imperfect information about them. At the very least, that means that you are likely to have this party fight in terms of the question of policies and what is meaningfully better for this country's future. By the way, all the mitigation that that member of opposition brought up in the first part of their speech clearly decreases a lot of their arguments as well. Because if their entire argument is reliant off of this one party being stable, then the fact that it is a parliamentary democracy and secondary parties come up based off of the fact that it's a parliamentary democracy, as they say, then it clearly has some case tension as well. Onto the material about violence. There are a variety of mechanisms as to why violence is comparatively likely to be better on our side. Before I get into that, I want to quickly deal with a very, very flippant response that comes from CEO, which is that, oh, but there's multiple ethnicities. Yes, there are multiple ethnicities, but some of them are larger than others. Some of them were also favored by the colonists when it is they decided to do things such as indirect rule. So that means that those parties consistently consolidate their own power and consolidate their own wealth through things such as patronage networks. Go ahead, opening opposition.
If, as you say, voters in these states are so nationalistic and tribal, why will you possibly get these multi-ethnic coalitions rather than parties merely competing on who can be more racist? The way you actually prevent ethnic violence is when citizens are wealthy and institutions are developed, which only our side provided a path
So
for.
number one, citizens are not wealthy because it is only the majoritarian citizens who are the ones that are able to do this. And number two, because as we explained to you, and this is perfect because it perfectly moved me into Naomi's mechanisms, there's no longer the comparative advantage of ethnicity. The BJP cannot run on just Hindu nationalism when there are two Hindu parties. So when there is no longer a comparative advantage, they have to be able to fight with the other signaling effects that are able to get them voters. And the secondary BJP party is likely to try to attempt to move towards getting catering votes from other parties because they can no longer rely on just the domination of Hindu voters. So when that happens, there are a variety of, and so that coalition is built. By the way, as well, you know that these other ethnic minority parties are going to be the ones that manage to get some sort of power. The reason why you know this is because that's what opposition's case entirely relies on. The opposition's case about economic stability relies on consistent party overturn. So you know that opposition has already conceded this analysis. Why is it that these ethnicities became dominant? Because of things such as SOEs, because of things such as these increasing patronage networks, and because of things such as the increase in resources that they predominantly give to a majority group. There are two broad impacts that are more important than anything else in this debate. Number one, that the successionary movement itself creates violence when it is there are civil conflicts within the country. But number two, it incentivizes the government to crack down on these so-called terrorists, which oftentimes makes this violence significantly worse. It is very, very clear that the safety of these individuals is the most important. In weighing, though, number one, economic collapse is more likely to happen even if a revolutionary government comes in that West doesn't trust that revolutionary government, and firms do not care about things such as do not care about are unwilling to invest in stable countries. Number two, we far outweigh the impact of opening government, who says that these parties are authoritarian, because these parties majority parties become far more authoritarian when they can justify it under the narrative of cracking down on parties. How do we beat OG as well, though? What we also told you was that these court processes were uniquely likely to be good, answering the clarification that unfortunately Prime Minister did not take from closing opposition, and the challenge that opening opposition gives that they do not necessarily say. Three reasons why. Number one, because they are likely to be non-partisan. It is oftentimes codified. Secondly, because it is easier for the West and international community to keep it accountable. And third of all, because there is a deterrent effect as well for many of these parties, i.e. if you try to push up the military, there's more of an ability for these courts to be able to engage with you. Let's be very, very clear. The question of violence in this debate is by far the most important. The Biafran civil war and the current attacks on Kashmir means that individuals are unable to access any of the secondary needs that all the other teams in this debate have addressed. Opposition's claim is reliant off these ethnic and minority parties getting power. We flip that claim and prove that it is significantly better than the violence that is likely to be perpetuated. Very proud to stand on closing government.
Great, thank you. Now calling on the op whip.
Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Cool. 3, 2, 1. We will not let CG to strawman our case. We are happy to promote new parties being small and then later grow and get a lot of trust, or like at least some kind of accountability that you can predict what kind of policies they can promote, not only being in the opposition or like a part. CG never proved why urgency is the main metric in this debate and why we shouldn't prioritize long-term stability. Therefore, it's unclear why this is important. But second of all, their metric about the violence rely on unproven case. They never tell us why, if you have a bad party and you split that for 5 bad parties, because that's their case following by OG, you will create better stability and these people change their incentives and start to respect ethnic minorities. But also, and I think that's the biggest flaw of both government teams. All teams rely on that this is some easy thing to do, that break up the monopoly of the party in the emerging democracy will be like poof, and then you create brand new world. Never analyze how the campaign process will look like, who is likely to be elected after this, how people are likely to vote after all, and why this one of the pieces from this main party will be much better than one big party coalition, which they need to analyze in the debate. Therefore, it's extremely unclear how they should beat Hadar analysis. So I will sum up the golf bench case very easy. We have bad party who have monopoly, who is very powerful. We will split that for 5 small parties with the same names, with the same recognition, with the same people reminding of them. And we magically create this stable democracy with a free choice. It's unclear for me how many steps of analysis they missed. But let's talk about their engagement, our extension, which was almost untouchable. Hadar gave you 5 points of rebuttal, which conclusion is as follows. A, she said that they never analyzed the lack of their premise, that people are stupid, and in the first place, they are illegitimate to vote for this dominant party. Because if this is emerging democracy, therefore, still majority of the people voting for these parties, and they never explained, I know that that might be intuitive, but check your notes panel, if they analyze why these people have no right or choice to pick this party, even if that serves in their interest. The same problem happened now in Poland, when more than 50% vote for law and justice, and people demonized their voters and say that they have no right, and the backlash is massive, right? As long as government never proved their premise, it's unclear. But second of all, I think Hadar proved to you that if they claim that courts are so fair and courts are not corrupt, that support our case, right? Therefore, we are capable to create check and balance. Therefore, we have the same fiat as they claim they have to have the stability, but with the better other points. But yeah. Thirdly, what are our extension, which was the rebut example not necessarily analyzed. Our extension, its position in this debate as applying to emerging democracies, not the India example like CG, not the Bangladesh example as OG. We told you what is the characterization of the emerging democracies and the dominant parties, that you have the long history of what was your actions, right? What kind of policies you promote, with who you get the coalition, how much minorities you respected or not, like what kind of decision economically you made. Comparatively, all of the other parties or small parties, you have unknown. It's unclear for me if after this first election will happen, what kind of information I will get. They never analyze how media gave the same amount of attention, who will shape the discourse, how people will portray this. If their case is about ethnic minorities or like or ethnic groups, it's very easy to weaponize this rhetoric between these groups, but also it's unclear if one group have 50% of ethnicity, the other group have 20%. How stable you will be, who will take the lead, what kind of policies you will propose. They never look for the long term, which is, I think, horrible in this debate. But second of all, we also analyze the democratic procedure, untouchable. We told you that if we don't need to prove that these courts will be corrupt, but does the politicians have incentive to create the perceptions that they are unfair, that you are taking certain freedoms from people, which create to higher radicalization, if that's the metric, from closing government? Because you feel that you can't trust even the courts, right? Because people are shaping in the media, especially when they still have the amount of trust which they earned before, because you are not killing the members of these parties, you are just breaking them up. So it's unclear how you decrease their influence in the media, or at least was under-analyzed by the government bench. I wanted to talk about OG now and about their principle of free choice. Look, panel, how they assert that that will lead to fair division, never analyzed, didn't take the clarification or engagement with us. But let's take them at their best. They said that these parties have connection to majority and to the religion, and after you break them up, then you will have discussion about the economics and the meaningful political discourse. But they still will be religious to some extent, right? They still will be liked by the majority. It's unclear for me what is the likelihood that you will shift this discourse, which your case relies on so much. But second of all, they said that the main metric is greater choice. This metric is contingent on these parties winning the election, or like their choice being represented. I believe that if you will create instability, that small parties or fractions start to fight for power, will be incapable to create the coalition, you will not have the chance to expand your choice, right? Or like your freedom, because that will be limited, because you will be in the fear, or like what will happen tomorrow, or also what's going on in this country, what is the political situation, what kind of information I have, who I can trust. If you have lack of information, if your freedom is limited because you can't vote for someone which you did before, and when you know from the history, at least you know what you can predict, at least you can prepare the defense, at least you can prepare opposition, at least you can try to keep them accountable, especially with the liberalization, especially with the new metrics. Therefore, if OG want to win this debate, they're contingent on this choice being executed, which they never prove because they are lacking analysis. Let's compare us to opening opposition, and I have 4 metrics why we are winning with opening up. The first one is we take the metrics from both governments and we fully engage in this. Second of all,
I think you're muted.
Hi, we cannot hear you.
how long you can hear me?
Max 15 or 20 seconds, probably. Not too long.
Okay, so I will just make 20 seconds more, which is amount which I have left on my timer.
Yeah, jump back to like 6:20. The last point I heard you say, you had there's like a couple reasons we take it over OO. I heard your first one, and the second you said started saying the second is where I lost it.
Okay. So let me put like less than a minute a speech. 3, 2, 1. We give you the case which is much more linked to the political parties and the actual elections, not necessarily to taking down the ruling party, right? We gave you the structural reasons, how the political party discourse is functioning, but more important, we gave you better engagement with the government metrics and also more universal to the emerging democracies and not pinpointing the examples in this debate, because I don't think that average citizen voter have a lot of information what will happen in Bangladesh and India without any analysis or showing why this example is unique structural analysis, which will be spreading in other countries. Proud to oppose.
Great, thank you.